Star Wars Battlefront II was released on the 17th of November 2017, and it undoubtedly had an extremely eventful life, seeing the highest of highs after the lowest of lows. And thus begins my three-part series on this unique gaming story. I'll have for you how Battlefront 2 pulled off an incredible gaming comeback, and whether it's still worth your time in 2020, but today we just have to kick things off by looking at the controversial question, did Battlefront 2 deserve to die for the future of Battlefield? And no doubt many of you are already screaming no, and I totally get that, but we need to look at all of the available angles to build up that discussion. So welcome to another gaming video essay. I'm GetGoodGuy, and this was the ultimate sacrifice. Videos such as this are in part brought to you by the Board of Awesome. The support of these people on Patreon is deeply appreciated, especially right now, and they're all absolute heroes. And we're nearing 50,000 subscribers. If you're new here or enjoy this video, considering hitting that subscribe button to push us over the line would be epic, and you'll see loads more content from me. Thank you very much. Let's get something out of the way before anyone smashes me in the comments for being bad or using something cheesy or whatever. As I experienced on my Titanfall 2 video essay, I only recently picked this game up. I'm new. Let me enjoy it and learn. Alright? Good. Let's get to the point of today. On April 23rd, 2020, Battlefield 5 senior producer Ryan MacArthur addressed the Battlefield community and stated that the current chapter for the game was wrapping up in a few days on April 29th, and that coming after it in 2 or 3 months would be the final content update for Battlefield 5. A very early and unexpected end was nigh for Battlefield 5. Then on April the 28th, 2020, creative director for Battlefront 2, Dennis Branval, spoke on behalf of the development team and stated that the vision for Star Wars Battlefront 2 was now complete. The final content update for the game was about to be released, and that would be that. A very sudden end, although an end absolutely full to the brim with apparent gratitude for the community the game had built. When that was paired with information like Battlefield 6, or whatever it's going to be called, is in production, and that some developers that were previously working on Battlefront 2 are now moving over to that project, well, unsurprisingly, the rumour mill started up, conclusions were drawn, and many a Battlefront 2 fan got angry. And I get it. If we tackle the question, did Battlefront 2 deserve to die for Battlefield at purely face value, then no. The game itself did nothing wrong in that regard, at least once it had been turned around and transformed. No great game deserves as such to die, or to be ended, but all games must eventually end, at least if they're part of a rolling cycle in a series. And seeing Battlefield as being ultimately to blame for the end of Battlefront 2 may also be flawed. There's always grey areas within the black and white, grey areas that need to be explored along with that black and white. But let's handle the topic of comparing the two games first, to really fill out our wider understanding of the background. First off, it's probably pertinent to look at the petitions for saving both Battlefield 5 and Battlefront 2. Well, on change.org, the petition for continued content support for BF5 has garnered 16.8 thousand signatures. 16.8k seems like a decent amount until you compare it with that of Battlefront 2, which on the same website has gained 111,000 signatures for continued content support. Already we can see the massive backing that this game has from its community, and thus can extrapolate just how large the feeling of disappointment and potential anger was when it was suddenly ended without really any kind of warning, especially when you throw in the situation with Battlefield 6. But what about actual players? Well, I don't want to go into too much detail and focus on player numbers for all platforms today, as it doesn't change the outcome nor the potential reasons for the two games being brought to a close, and the sales and support on each platform tend to follow a very similar trend for a title. It's relevant to lay out in a basic fashion these numbers for those that argue that Battlefront 2 deserved more time and or respect. So we'll analyse the PlayStation 4 player counts, obviously a massively popular platform for these two products. So no, these numbers don't cover Xbox, Steam or Origin, but the trend and contrast are what's important here. So here's the player count outline for Battlefield 5 via GameStat.com. You may have seen me reference this in a video recently specifically on Battlefield 5. It shows that Battlefield 5 had around 7 million players, had around 130,000 new players through July 2nd to August 2nd, and saw 99,000 players return to the game, or more specifically, 99,000 players who returned and earned a trophy in the last month. Now let's look at the Star Wars Battlefront 2 numbers on PlayStation 4. Again, again according to GameStat.com. Around 16.7 million total players, 990,000 new players, so just under a million, and 880,000 returning players who earned a trophy. Let's compare. That sees Battlefront 2, the game that many argue as having been cancelled for Battlefield, hitting 9.7 million more players on PlayStation, 860,000 more new players in that 1 month period, and 781,000 more returning players who earned a trophy in that 1 month period, despite the final update for Battlefront 2 coming some way before the final update for Battlefield 5. So obviously these numbers could be seen as being very supportive for those that argue Battlefront 2 should have taken precedent over Battlefield. In reality, that argument may be highly flawed, as we'll get to, but what these numbers do support is that Battlefront 2 was just undeniably a more successful game, a better commercial success, and indeed an incredible example of a game that recovered and came back from the brink of collapse, amidst a controversy that had genuine industry-affecting impact. It must be noted that Battlefront 2 had a free-to-play period, as we can see here on the graph, which will have heavily affected those numbers, but it still cements its dominance over Battlefield 5, as if we look at the 1st of June, before that sudden rise, Battlefront 2 had amassed 10.84 million players. BF5 at the same date had amassed 6.7 million players. And realistically, BF5 was never going to catch up if both games continued to be supported. Plus, those returning player numbers were vastly different and heavily favoured Battlefront 2 as well. Now we could go and analyse sales numbers for the games and all of that, but really the message is already clear. It's rammed home by active player counts and the coverage we've seen of these two games for the past couple of years. We know Battlefront 2 did way better. But what many haven't considered is that it just doesn't have to be about that. It doesn't have to come down to this game is better than that game, so this game should carry on, or this game should take their devs away, etc. Because how much longer would you or anyone else have liked Battlefront 2 to be supported? And to what potentially detrimental effect? Everything has to end. Could it have gone on for longer and still been successful? Absolutely, without doubt. Was this ultimately 100% the right time for the game to end from a purely Battlefront focused perspective? That alone is very arguable when you strip away all of the outer context. The game itself was still seemingly doing well. And was its sudden end without any particular lead up or significant warning the best way for it to be handled? Well, no, likely not. The way things panned out haven't helped the situation. But as someone who spent nearly 2 years covering BF5 and dealing with how EA and DICE tend to approach things, this really came as no surprise to me. Either way, as disappointing as its end was for the Battlefront fans, especially with no new game announced to look forward to and pin hopes upon, Battlefront 2 did have 2.5 years of content updates. That's 2.5 years of free, fresh content, around 25 content updates in total. It saw The Last Jedi season, the Solo season, Clone Wars season, Rise of Skywalker updates, and original trilogy updates. These included everything from cosmetics, mode variations, fresh cards, maps such as Endor, Hoth, and so on. There were new heroes. They even added a fresh chunk to the story or campaign. By the way, the campaign was the one thing that I think the game maybe would deserve to have ended for, at least the original story. I just thought it was completely lackluster and it was heavily criticised by reviewers if I remember rightly. But regardless, anyone would be hard pushed to claim that the game wasn't well supported from a content standpoint. In fact, I've read through all of the updates and it sounds like an absolute treasure trove of stuff when compared with what BF5 players often received. And maybe that only makes it worse for some of you, as again you'll point to the better game being the one that ended. But let's not ignore that BF5 ended too. In fact, it ended way early. The only reason it looks like Battlefield came out on top is because we know the next one is coming next year, and that's where developer efforts have gone. Maybe this was a solid time to end Battlefront 2 though. Even if it wasn't the absolute optimal time, it might still be a decent one. After all of that, after an amazing turnaround, whether it was planned long term or a sudden decision, they smashed this game out of the park from a long life perspective in this current gaming landscape in a way nobody could have seen coming when it first released. There's always the argument of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or basically this game is still successful, so just keep riding it. But at some point you have to cut ties. And if that's to the betterment of another title under the umbrella of that developer or that publisher, then it's at least somewhat understandable. Especially when you consider that DICE LA is currently being revamped and possibly completely changed under Vince Zampella for an entirely new game. So things at DICE are quite different, and they're still working at home going on. Potentially the best way to look at it is probably not as Battlefront ending for Battlefield, as is the commonly held belief, and indeed what we're tackling today. It's about there always being a time to look forward. Before the player base does actually get bored and move on. A time to plan, set down fresh foundations, especially with new consoles coming out, and with Star Wars Battlefront always having the option to return. Again, I'll say that I do 100% think this could have been handled better. You guys have my sympathy if you missed Battlefront, and it's all a shame that BF5 was a colossal mess, which basically forced this situation into action, and now Battlefield 6 has to bounce back to turn around and save the franchise. But all of that makes it kind of understandable, even if you don't want to support it. Let's also consider that putting their resources into BF6 was likely going to be the eventuality in the end either way. That game was always going to be in production for release around this point. Perhaps not so for Battlefront, and it's not as if Star Wars is going to suddenly lose mass popularity in the relevant future. It wouldn't make any sense for the series to be ending here when it's so successful. So I have very little doubt that Star Wars Battlefront will return, and hopefully return in full force. We just don't know exactly when. It's a bankable venture when they choose to utilize it, whereas right now Battlefield isn't, and it needs saving, at least from their perspective. So did Battlefront deserve to die or end for Battlefield? No. Is that actually what happened? Who knows? But either way, there are reasons for it, and the course of events we've got now are what are going to take place. They can't be altered. One game ends as a failure, one game ends as a success. Brought to an end for different reasons, but with a clear goal: to focus upon the next generation of consoles and games, and to nail down future success, starting with Battlefield. But no doubt with Battlefront returning to success at some point if they've got any sense. And besides, it's not as if Star Wars Squadrons isn't on the way. All of this stuff has to be carefully timed in ways that aren't always apparent to the consumer. And so, please let me know what you think. Whether it's about Battlefield, Battlefront, the two combined, and what you hope for from the future, let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe for a lot more. I do in-depth video essays like this, reviews and gameplays, and all the links to my social media, including Twitter, Patreon, all of that, can be found in the description and my pinned comment. And with that all said, I am GetGoodGuy, and I'll see you next time. Laters. Fall Guys has pretty much become their surprise big arrival onto the mainstream scene, and it's published by Devolver Digital. So, you play as a bean.